I gotta finish Romans 9. I've got, these are the same two words of the day. I did add to the some of the verses that I had in there that are kind of keynote verses, and I added some from 10 because I'm hoping we can get up to 10. Last time we stopped at 21. I'll give you the quick and dirty on the words of the day. Let's see. S-K-L-E-R-E-N-E. Could be a U, like. Sceleros. Sceleros is, scelerono basically means to render stubborn, is figurative in Greek. Indurate means to make into stone, turn into stone. So, for example, the Medusa Scalerou you, right? If you looked at her, she'd turn you into stone. And the reason this was important is because we were looking at the verses that talks about in 9 that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or hardened the heart. And if we remember that the heart is part of which piece in Greek thought? Sarx. Then we understand immediately, remember which part can God affect according to Greek thought, according to, well, ancient thought, or the thought, what is the only part that God can, well, what parts can God affect?
Sarx and pneuma.
The God can affect the sarx and pneuma, but he can't affect suke, which we usually think of as thought. But the real point here in thinking about, in just thinking in general about this, is it's interesting. What has affected our culture to make our culture not think this way? What assumption? There's both an assumption and a reality in the way that our culture has come about.
Biology? I mean, that we know?
No, not really biology so much. It's just the way we think about it. Like, for example, and I'm trying to think of a good example that isn't too scurrilous. There are obvious examples that are very obvious in human anatomy. Okay, if a guy sees a beautiful woman, he might have a physical effect because he sees her. If you see someone you love, you may have an immediate physical effect of what? Greater heartbeat or blood pressure, right? If someone lies to you and you immediately know it, you immediately have an effect in your heart and mind, right? You immediately have a physical effect. The Greeks in the ancient world believed that those physical effects were totally based in your body. That when you had a physical reaction to a person, right? That's the heart. That's cardia. When you have a physical reaction of blood pressure increasing, or they didn't know anything about blood pressure, but you know, your heartbeat increasing, that was cardia. That's sarx. See? We don't think that way. Why don't we think that way? What do we think is the center and rule of all the emotions?
The mind.
What's that?
The mind.
Yeah, so suke. We immediately imagine that the suke, now in the Greek worldview, what is the mind? Is it your brain? No, they have no idea. Yeah, they have no idea what causes, you know, we have this 20th century understanding that our thoughts come from the brain, right? And we believe that they're chemical impulses, so maybe we're closer to the Greeks than we think. But the reality is that in Greek thought, it is your immediate reaction is sarx. But then if you put those reactions through your brain, it becomes suke. And so therefore Paul's total words to everyone in all the, you can take this to all the books, because he's a Greek writer, right? You take this to all of his writings, all of his letters, right? Not just his letters, who else's writings, or who else's things about who else? The Gospels. You can take them to the other letters. You can take them to anything because they're Greek writers. They're thinking this way. Or they wouldn't be writing in Greek to a large measure, right? They're also thinking in Hebraic thought, and we're going to see a little bit of that too, which is interesting. But the whole point is, what do we do in our culture? In our culture, we assume what about emotions? They are
Untrustworthy, maybe?
well, they come from our thoughts. We believe they come from our thoughts. Is that true? Do your emotions really come from your thoughts? For example, if you get really mad at your kid and you want to swat him, I mean, swatting him is not bad, but getting really mad at him to the point where you swat him, right? What did you just do? What part of you take over?
Physical.
Your physical. Yeah, yeah. The Greeks would be very clear on this in their minds, in the way they think about things, but we aren't, right? Yet Christian thought, that's what I'm trying to get at. What has changed in our culture? Now it's changing back again.
It's in a postmodern society, isn't it? Pretty much, suke is part of sarx because we think everything's biological, evolution, there's no God, and it's all.
Well, we have kind of gotten, we are coming in postmodernism to the point of, we are basically going back to the ancient world, to faith, right? Because in the ancient world, what did the Greeks believe was the point? Sarx, faith, right? That you couldn't get away from it. Because if I feel impassioned about someone, what do I then do? Yeah, do something. I have sex. Passion, the word pathos, is the same word in Greek. If you want to look for a word that means sex in Greek, pathos is about as close as you can get. Pathos means that I have impassioned desire and I'm fated. I'm fated. No matter whether it's male or female, it doesn't matter to them, because to them, the sarx, the reaction of sarx that I feel, that pathos, that's pathos. And so I have to act out on the pathos. Why? Because I'm fated, right?
That's pretty much exactly what our postmodern culture is saying today. Like, if it feels good, you should do it, or why should you deny your impulses to do what you feel is natural, and so on.
Bingo. What happened? What happened between this in the ancient world and faith, and now the idea that suke can control? What is that? That is Christian thought.
Christian thought.
That's Christian thought. This is what Paul keeps telling them. Paul's message in all of his letters is that how do you prevent the sarx from controlling you? Through suke. In the modern era, what do we say?
Oh, control
you can't control your impulse. We can't control young people. They're going to have sex anyway, so give them protection. The protection doesn't work very well, but that's okay, right? If it feels good, if it makes you feel good by giving them condoms, right? Right? Remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, what do you think that kind of thought is? That's Christian suke thinking. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. It matters what the result is. That's also Christian thinking. See, what we've done in postmodernism, which is exactly right, postmodernism is going back to the idea of, think it, do it. Fate. You're fated. You might as well. You're fated, right? You're going to die anyway. This is total abolition of responsibility, the total abolition of thought. We're moving into the postmodern world, which is really sad. But what Paul is telling you is opposite. And this is why, so many people, and I've had people talk to me about this, because they wonder, in the modern world, we say, well, how can we control ourselves? And Paul's answer would be what? Suke, with the help of pneuma, right? But in the modern era, the problem with people is they say, well, I can't stop. Paul said the same thing. But what do you think, where do you think it stopped for Paul? Well, no, where do you think it, Paul says that I do things I know I shouldn't do, right? I can't stop it. What was Paul's problem? Do you remember? Paul's problem was he couldn't help make people mad. He couldn't keep his mouth shut. The guy irritated people just by talking, which is a good thing he wrote letters, because I guess he irritated them less with the letters than he did with his talking. But from Luke, from the Acts, we know that every time Paul went anywhere, what did he end up doing? Running away. You know, run away, cajoling, right? Because the guy had a problem. His problem was he couldn't control whether it was his anger, whether it's his enthusiasm, something. But what was the answer to solving that? Suke. And how did Paul even, you know, I think Paul eventually solved his problem. How did he solve his problem? It's obvious.
Stayed in jail.
Well, he stayed in jail and got killed, right, for it. But he wrote letters. I'm not sure I'd want to sit on a missive by Paul. I don't think I would want to sit with him on Mars Hill. Because I think he's one of these kind of people. You know, there's some of the people you talk to and you can't ever talk to them. They're not listening to you. You're not listening, right? I'm talking to you and you're talking to me, but you're not listening to me. You don't care what I think, right?
Pontificate.
But when Paul got to letter writing, when he wrote letters, it seems that what he did was he was able to take all that thinking thoughts and put them down on paper in such a way that he could communicate exactly what he wanted, right? You know, we look for solutions to our problems in the modern era. Paul would say the solution is suke, and I think his solution was beautiful in that. Let's see, this last word here, Trechontos, comes from trecho. Trecho means to run. And the reason I bring it up, I don't know if we passed that verse yet. It has a course to run, but it's translated, anyways, it's translated in a way that it's kind of really misses the mark. But let's go to, we're at chapter 9, look at 22. And as you remember, I'm just going to give a quick one. This is, they're asking the question, why didn't God make us Jews, therefore make us the chosen people? And I'm not going to go back through all the arguments we've gone through, but, we're building, Paul is still on this, he's building arguments. He's explaining why why it's okay for Christ to be the Messiah of the Romans, or the Greeks. And so, again, this is pertinent to us, although we may not ask exactly the same kind of questions that they ask, but still the pertinent thing is, if you think about it, and this is why Suke is really good, right? If you think about it, these are questions you probably ask yourself, but everyone's they're afraid to ask, and sometimes they're afraid of the answer, right? Aren't we? That's kind of why I like to have this class, because I feel like in this class you can ask any question. You can ask any question. You shouldn't be afraid of the answer, because I'm not going to give you a theological answer unless it's like a theological, historical thing we could kind of touch on. But I'll try to give you an answer that is historically based, right? And so then we don't feel bad, right? We don't have to feel bad, because any question we ask, if it's historical, right? How can it be a bad question if it's historical? See? That's pretty good. But, and if we answer it historically, then everything's copacetic, even if we don't like the answer. So this is a good thing about this kind of class, I think. Anyway, in 22, what if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath? This was the thing before this, which basically is alluded to in Jeremiah, is in 21 it says, does not the potter have the right to make the same lump of clay some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? Now I want you to bear in mind, remember Greek is very concrete. Greek is concrete. So in the Greek mind, what was made? What part was made?
The body.
The sarx was made. There's a beautiful, you see, in our view, when I tell you that, for example, the potter makes the pot, there's an assumption here, right? That's obvious to a Greek. That may not be as obvious to us. Because what's the point of a pot?
It's a vessel. It holds something.
It holds something. It didn't say, what did the potter not make, guys?
The holdings.
The content.
The contents.
The potter didn't make the contents. Now, the potter may choose what he might put in that pot until he sells it, or gives it, or whatever. But the important point to note here is that the vessel was made by the potter. So if we talk about the vessel in terms of the sarx, and remember the argument is, why wasn't I made a Jew? What is the vessel here, guys? Well, I'm a Roman vessel, right? I'm a Gentile vessel. You see?
Throw it away and destroy it.
Well, if you don't know the question, if you read through this and you say, okay, I'm just reading through this and I'm not even contemplating this as an argument to teleologos to tell us about in Greek thought, right? I'm just going to assume this is just some English treatise. And I read, well, does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for noble persons and some for common use? Then we assume that he's talking about what? Generically everyone and everything, right? But if I tell you that it's obvious, because Paul already asked the question, it's obvious that he's asking, that the Romans' question is, why wasn't I made a Jew? They're chosen and I'm not chosen, and I want to be chosen, right? So it's obvious that he's talking about what? The pottery, the sarx that we were put in. Oh, that we were put in. The contents. Well, let's see what he says about contents. What if God, choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? Okay, what are his objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? How about all the pots? All the pots? Because all the pots are gone, right? Pots made of clay. What happens to pay? Clay. Return to dust. Let's see. 23. What if he did this to make the riches of his glory, doxia, known to the objects of his eleo, his mercy, whom he had prepared in advance for doxia. Now, the fact he's using the word doxia, I've already told you. Remember, if he's using the word arena, he's generally talking to the Jews. If he uses the word kais, he's talking generally grace, he's talking to the Greeks. If he's using the word doxa, he's generally talking to the Romans. What if he did this to make the riches of his doxa known to the objects of his eleo, whom he prepared in advance for doxa? 24, even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but from the Gentiles. So it was God's choice, number one, not fate. Number one, it was God's choice. Remember, we have a competing thing here. The competing thing is bathos of the gods. That's the fate of the gods. The gods are fated, right? So Paul's number one thing in talking to these guys has been telling us from the very beginning. Is God fated?
No.
No. God can make a choice. And by the way, his choice is eklogos. Eklogos. His choice is, we translate election. That's a terrible translation in my opinion, but that's okay. Choice by logic. God chooses through logic because God is the ultimate what? Actually, Christ is the ultimate logos argument. Christ is the ultimate argument. And the whole thing of the gospel is a logos to telos, right? That's the point. So it's the bathos of the gods, the God that God has choice. At the same time, there's pathos. Pathos is based in sarx. Guess what? You don't have a choice in the pot that was made to contain you. Because what are you? Are you just sarx? No. In Greek thought, you are also suke and pneuma. And by the way, here's an interesting one that's going to blow your minds. I'm sorry, I'm going to bring this up, but is pneuma eternal? Or is pneuma not eternal? Now, you don't have to answer that question. It's okay. But this is one of the great theological questions. This is why I always say it's very difficult for people to talk about theology because most people aren't ready to talk about theology. Because did you know this is one of the great spiritual questions? Because is your pneuma supposed to be eternal? It sure is. But things that are eternal, do they have a beginning and end? No. Ooh. Ooh. Uh-oh. I either change my assumptions or change my definitions. I'm just saying. Okay. You don't have to answer a question. But, you know, in Paul's thought, where do you think Paul's going with this? If the pot is what? Made by the potter and will eventually be discarded. But yet the contents of the pot, what's contents? Now, there's more to this, right? Of course there's always more to this. The thing to note, and I want you to kind of note this, Paul's not talking about the loss of salvation in any of this. Because that's not the question. By the way, was that question already answered? The question was already answered a long time ago, right? He's not talking about diakosune. And even now he's not talking about the pneuma and how to do right. He's talking about something else here. Because the question is, then why wasn't I made a Jew? 24 I did, even us whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. 25, as he says in Hosea, now listen to this very carefully, I will call them my people, who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one, who is not my loved one. That comes from Hosea chapter 2. Let me see. In the context, don't read everything, but let's see. 18. 2:18, I'll go on. 23 is the allusion. In that day I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creatures that move along the ground. Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, and they will all lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice. Remember, different words, but righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. And that day I will respond, declares the Lord. I will respond to the skies, and they will respond to the heaven. And the earth will respond to the grain, and the new wine and oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. Now, this has a little bit to do with something else, too. Because, remember, there is a group that could never be his people. Remember who they were? The Edomites. Edomites. Edom, from Edom, who, by the way, was also Herod the Great. Paul's allusion, he's not saying the pots, just the pots that are Jews, and just the pots that are Gentiles, and just the pots that are Romans. He's also saying, what other pots? Remember, just before this, the allusion was to Jacob, whom I loved, and Esau, whom I hated. So, and remember I told you, Greek, it's not really hated. I loved less. I despised, not necessarily hated in the sense of English. But in any case, so now we get a quote that says, the one I didn't love. So who else is included in this? Edomites. Esau. So not only, the question is, why was I made a Jew? And Paul's answer is, you don't have a choice, number one, and number two, does it matter? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. 26. And it will happen in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people. They will be called sons of the living God. And that's from Hosea, let's see, Hosea 10. Let's see, going up to that. Watch, you should read these all in context because these are beautiful. This is right after Gomer conceived again. Anyway, 7. Yet I will show love to the house of Judah, and I will save them. Not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son, and the Lord said, call him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. And 11, the people of Judah and the people of Israel will be united, and they will appoint one leader, and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. That's pretty special. See what Paul's done? He's taken, and within the context, and that's why I say if you go back, and I probably need to give you the rest, I don't know if I've given you all the allusions and all the quotes from the Old Testament or all the pieces. I probably need to do that some more. But if you look at them all in context and see what they're saying, they not only bear directly on the argument that Paul's making, but they fit in the context, even greater context than we would imagine. Yeah.
It's hard not to hear all this and think that there's predestination.
How's that?
Well, when he's saying a whole race of people does not love, and I'm not your God. Well, their children and their children from then on. He's saying that too. So.
Not all of them. He already talked about how can you, well, he's going to get to it again. I mean, he can't stop telling you. This may be the irritant about Paul is he can't stop going back to his main point, which is okay, because that helps us that are English readers, right, and speakers. But what is the way you appropriate? How do you appropriate this? Yeah, you're convinced. I'm pisteo. What is that? Do you have choice?
Yes.
Yeah. Did God have choice?
Yes.
Yes. And who else has choice? You have choice. That's his point. It's not pathos. It's not sarx. It's suke. Suke is the answer. Suke is always the answer to Paul. And I think it's a beautiful answer. My kids, TMTL. Think more, talk less. Right? TMTL. I always tell my kids, TMTL. Think more, talk less. And they got it. Thank goodness, The thing is that's the point. Whenever you have that sarx reaction, think. If we could teach our kids to think, we wouldn't have any unwanted pregnancies before marriage. Of course, in the modern era, they don't care about marriage either, right? Marriage doesn't matter. But marriage matters to somebody, right?
The kid.
Well, not only to the kid, but there's, this is the thing I get at. Okay, so you made your point to the world, but you lost your soul. Okay, it ain't, we're playing around here with fire. Is this a theological? That's not a theological point. It's true. Okay, if you break the 10, right? If you break the 10 and don't repent, you got a problem. The Big 10. And of course, Big 10 are just the synopsis of the law. So, what would you be telling kids? If you break the Big 10, you've got a serious problem here coming, right? But what do we teach them? Oh, use a condom. Oh, that's going to help. What do you stand before God? I use a condom. And God said, what do you think God's going to say? Oh, man, he's good. Oh, can you see God shaking his head? Shaking his head. And everybody who told him to use a condom. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ said it's better for you that a millstone be put around your neck and be thrown into the ocean, which means the death penalty. Jesus never said you should kill people. Oh, you kind of supported the death penalty for, like, all the Jewish things. I think the Pope's going to have a problem with that, too. You know, the Pope led the Catholic Church away from, they don't support the death penalty for people who obviously need the death penalty. And I hope you notice that we don't put people to death. I think a guy, you know, first degree murder, killed his girlfriend just last week, and they gave him, what, 3 years? You know? Yeah, you know, you kill people left to right in this country. You know, the Gosnell, who's murdered, infanticide, murdered, you know, countless babies. A horrific thing if you've ever been keeping track on the non-mainstream news. The mainstream news won't cover any of it, but, you know, Gosnell is basically committing infanticide to born children. And, yeah, we'll be lucky if that guy gets a year and a half, you know, because he's doing a public service, you know, by killing children. And
Well, he might get worse because some of the women died too, so.
oh, he killed
They
an adult, yeah.
Some people might care.
Because he killed adults?
Yeah, some of the moms died, and also, like, his clinic was completely, you know, filthy and not up to any standards, and he was breaking all these laws with having unlicensed people medicate the patients and stuff, so people might care about that, if nothing else.
You know what? What's ironic about this is, did you know that therapeutic abortions have always been legal in the United States of America? You know what a therapeutic abortion is, right? One that is necessary. You know, ectopic pregnancies and other, you know, issues. For example, you know, a broken, you know, womb that's been, you know, there's a word for it. Anyway, there have always been therapeutic. Every Catholic hospital would do a therapeutic abortion in a heartbeat. But the ones that were illegal and that were challenged were those that were done not for therapeutic reasons, but for choice, to choose to kill your child. I say don't do the sex, you won't have the baby, but that's okay. You know, sex isn't important. God's gonna, you know, I don't want to stay before the Almighty God and try to justify any actions in that. Anyway, the point is, Sark Suke. Paul says the answer is always Suke. In 27, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. Though the number of Israelites be like the sand by the sea, only a remnant will be saved. And in that, let's see. Let's look at 19. This is from Isaiah 10, chapter 10. Let's look at 19. 22 and 23 are the specific words, are verses. The splendor of the forest and fertile fields, it will be completely destroyed, and as when a sick man wastes away. And the remaining trees of his forest will be so few that a child could write them down. And that day the remnant of Israel, the survivors of the house of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Through our people, your people, O Israel, will be like the sand by the sea, only a remnant will return. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. The Lord Almighty, will carry out the destruction decreed upon the whole land. Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty says. O my people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians, who beat you with a rod and lift up a club against you as Egypt did, etc., etc., etc. The point here is that their question is, why didn't God make me a pot that was a Jew?
Kosher.
A kosher pot. And the answer is, not only does God calling those from those he didn't love before, which is Esau, which is the worst case, right? The worst case you could be is be an Edomite, right? Because God said, not only will you not stand in the temple, you know, there's no hope for your redemption in the temple with Esau, but there is with Christ. And not only that, you know, and this is a contrast. The contrast is, okay, to the Romans, all the Jews won't be saved. All the Jews won't be. Why? What's the determining factor? Is it the choice of God? No.
It's the choice of the people to follow him or not.
It's a choice not just of the people, but the individual.
Well, each.
Well, see, that's important because, you see, I think it's really important to note that, you know, in Paul's writing here, okay, it isn't that, you know, God chose these people from among the Jews, or God chose these people from among the Gentiles, or God chose these people from among the Romans. Who did God choose among the Jews? He chose them all. But what did the Jews do?
They either made a choice to reject or follow.
Some chose, some did not. Teen Hodos chose to follow. Paul chose to follow. Peter chose to follow. Many of the Jews did choose to follow. Okay? What about the Romans? Did God choose them?
Yes.
God chose them. God chose, well, Paul, you see, we think, you know, it is so easy for us to go and say, God chose the whole world. But that's not the ancient view of the world. The ancient view of the world, you know, the gods have the world cut up into pieces, right? They're, you know, the same gods that are ruling in China are not the same gods ruling in Japan or ruling in Greece or ruling in wherever, right? You guys should know that because Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I mean, you guys were worshiping what? Wotan, right? That's Wednesday's God. Make sure you get the right gods on the right days. Don't mess it up. You know, Frida on Friday, okay? Frida's a great goddess, right? Because she's giving you Friday. But the big deal here is the world view in the ancient world is the world is driven by these different gods. And so is it a critical question about whether God chose the Romans and the Greeks and the Gentiles? And guess who else he chose? The Edomites. He chose Esau's children whom he despised.
Would the Romans recognize the Hebraic thought about Edom?
Oh yeah, because, you know, this is something that I know they're trying to breed it out of the universities, but, you know, it is quite obvious from the Maccabean period and also from the historical documents of the Greeks that the Greeks really respected the Hebraic documents. And one of the reasons that the Greeks were so enamored with, for example, the proselytizing of the Pharisees in this period was because they wanted to know more about these ancient documents, the Old Testament documents, right? That's what really got them. And what do you think got the Romans? The Romans were interested because the Greeks were. You've got to follow this. You know, it's an intellectual kind of thing. The Romans were interested because the Greeks were. The Greeks were interested because they just loved anything that had been written in antiquity. This was like their thing, right? So, you know, this is something that in the ancient world was a driving factor. Same way with Hellenization. You know, Hellenization, everyone talks about Hellenization. Until you face, you know, I think in this class we've seen the ramifications of Hellenization. Talk about powerful force and effect in the world, you know. But, you know, before this class, you know, I hope that your thought of Hellenization were like, well, who cared about Alexander the Great, right? But Alexander the Great laid the foundations for everything we see pretty much in history. And yet, and then when Christ's coming, as a matter of the coming of Christ, the Christ's death and resurrection was such a factor and force in the world, it changed the world from Sarks to Suke and Pneuma. When the Greeks were totally trying to do this, the Greeks, one of the Greek things was, the Greek worldview was trying to change, you know, Mysterion ideas. But what did Christianity push them into, finally? Remember the religious things? I always write it down. You start with animism, you go to pantheonic paganism, you go to Mysterion, and what's the next one? Gnosticism. Now, the fact that Christianity forced the world into Gnosticism means what won? Suke won. Now, we say Gnosticism isn't a good thing, and I agree. Gnosticism is really postmodern. Actually, Gnosticism is really more Enlightenment period type thinking. But that's okay, because at least what did it get the world to do? Think! Yeah, give me a thinking world any day over a Sark's world. A Sark's world, you have people believing that pot can cure illness, and that, you know, crystals will cure you, and herbal supplements are good for your body. Okay? I mean, we have, you know, and vitamins, the vitamin stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in a Sark's pathos belief cycle. You know, homeopathic ideas, all kinds of medieval. Homeopathy is a medieval idea, you know, right? All kinds of ideas. Now, some have some scientific basis, but many don't. How do you know?
Well, look at the science, and I mean, I take a little bit of exception to that as somebody who takes vitamins and stuff. Because there's scientific evidence, for example, that vitamin C aids with healing, and it's not just that. I mean, they've done studies and scientific method and that kind of stuff. It's not just an acceptance for acceptance sake or a mystic belief from way back when, but then they suggest it to a test. And some of the other ones they did, like this St. John's wort, you know, help with memory or whatever it was, and they found out really didn't. So, you know, you have to look at the evidence, and it doesn't mean that it's all bunk, but
It means that what we do is we apply suke, logic, and scientific method. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you a slight touch of natural theology, okay? Historical natural theology. In natural theology, the assumption is that God made the heavens and the earth. And therefore, whatever God put naturally on the surface of the earth, for example, foods and etc., that it's in a perfect balance for humankind. And that in humankind will screw up themselves in the world because the world is fallen through doing what? Abusing it. Gluttony, for example. So the answer would be, okay, maybe an orange a day keeps the doctor away, but the equivalent of 1,000 oranges that I take in my body, natural theology would say preposterous, because God didn't make it that way. Now, that's just natural theology. I'm not advocating that you know, there might be a possible miracle cure. All right? That, for example, Linus Pauling supported the idea of vitamin C being a very powerful help, for example. That's a good example. But every study that's been shown for vitamin C, you know, positive studies, you have negative studies, you know, and right now the science isn't out on that one. On echinacea. Echinacea, everybody thought echinacea was great. They did limited studies, and finally they did a big study in echinacea, and guess what? Echinacea doesn't do anything for you. St. John's wort, same thing's true. You can hurt your body. Take digitalis, foxglove, it will kill you eventually. Cyanide will kill you, arsenic will kill you. There are things that will kill you in the world. I personally like the bark of, what's that tree? I like aspirin. Acetylsalicylic acid is a great painkiller. But in natural theology would say that God gave us both the natural means in our minds and the natural means on the earth to be able to both make medicines and to understand the natural world. You see? And so what we should question with natural theology, and this is true, Newton did this, and so did all of the followers, you know, the early scientists, all the Christian-based scientists. Their first thing was, well, you guys heard of Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor is a Christian thought, is a Christian idea. It was proposed by a Christian philosopher. Occam's razor says that you always seek the simplest solution. That is natural theology, by the way. That comes right out of natural theology. It's a, you know, so anyway, as a scientist would say initially, if something looks like it's out of proportion to the natural order of the universe, then therefore I would not reject it, but I would challenge it. See, that's the first thing. And by the way, that is the first step in logic, too, right? If something doesn't appear correct, see? So I agree with you, but I'm just trying to put it into the context of, you know, what's the different worldviews? And I would say that we're moving into a negative worldview today. Yes?
This is a little off, however, I think maybe some of this, God of the land thing might still be prevalent. I had a coworker from Thailand, and I found out later she was a Buddhist, but she fell asleep at the wheel, and then something jerked her awake, and she was able to avoid an accident. And she said, Ellen, she said, I did not know what his name was. She felt like it was God that had done that for her. And she said, but I didn't know what his name was, like he was kind of an American God or something, So I had a lot of fun sharing scripture with her. But, and I don't know that she was ever convinced, because she said she would pray to Lord Jesus and Buddha. But I think that she still had that mindset that Buddha was for Eastern people and Asian people, and that we had some God here that was different, and maybe she needed to know this God because she was living in America.
The two most popular holidays in Japan are Valentine's Day and Christmas.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes.
They celebrate this things, but
And yet, they are a very interesting society, mixing Taoism with animism, kames, and with Buddhism. So they are a very interesting mix, cultural mix. And yeah.
I think you're right though, because when like Western missionaries would go to places like China or whatever, they'd see very, very little success, but as soon as they started getting the more indigenous people there starting to do the ministries and so on, that's when it really like exploded, because then people could see it wasn't the American God or the Western person's God or the white person's God, but it's God for everybody. And so the missions really take off when the indigenous people start to take them over.
Right, I would say that we have missed the point in modern Christianity, because when Paul went to these guys, do you think Paul told them to stop? Matter of fact, in any of Paul's writing, did Paul tell them to stop worshiping the great goddess Diana?
No.
No. Did he ever tell them not to do the Mysterium? No. He told them not to be changed in their minds, right? Not to allow it to overcome them. I think that in the early church, and I think it's obvious, because out of the early church came the Catholic belief in what? Praying to the saints and Mary. And so what they did in the original early church is I don't think they tried to squelch at all the religious ideas or thoughts of these other groups. They didn't say the great god Pan is dead. As a matter of fact, the Greeks killed off the great god Pan themselves. They didn't say that he was dead. They just put Jesus Christ and Jehovah as God and said, this is where your salvation comes from. And guess what? When your salvation comes from these guys, and I think you're right, you see that it's not a God, a local God. Your local God doesn't matter, right? When there's reports, right, that now this God is spreading over in England. I'm the Roman Empire. And this God is spreading to the Celts, those crazy people up there. You mean this God is more powerful than their God? This God is more powerful than the God of the Greeks? This God is more powerful than the God of the Egyptians? Right? So what do? It's the same way with Alexander. Alexander the Great came through, and what did the Egyptians do with their gods? Tossed them in ash heap. There's nobody believes in the Egyptian gods anymore. They only believe in the Greek gods. Remember? Cleopatra's Greek, guys. From about 300 BC, all of Egypt was Greek. They got rid of their gods. Okay? They got rid of their gods and they accepted the Roman gods. And so when Jesus Christ came through, it wasn't because it was a mortal conqueror. It was God conquering the world. Because people said, hey, this guy works. This is a true God. This makes sense. It fills a natural order. And this is very powerful. Very powerful. Today even. Let's see, 30. What shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue diakosune, righteousness, diakosune stands in place, I believe, completely for salvation. That's what Paul was using it for before. Who did not pursue diakosune have obtained it. A diakosune that is by pistis, that is by convincing. Therefore, they were making the choice. You see this? God held out salvation, that is diakosune, to the Jews. And they did what? They didn't accept it as a people. Some accepted it individually, not as a people, right? And now he hands out that same diakosune to the Romans. And Paul says, all you gotta do is take it. Take it. Matter of fact, the word uses lambano. Take it. But Israel, who pursued nomos of diakosune, has not attained it. This is really important because remember, why did the Romans and the Greeks go to the Jews in the first place? What were they looking for? The nomos of diakosune. They were looking for, how can I be righteous? How can I be diakosune, right? And they thought that by following the laws of the Jews, they could achieve that. That's what they wanted. They wanted this suke thing because they knew there was a sarx problem, right? And so they wanted it. But look what he says. But Israel, who pursued a nomos of righteousness. Who else was pursuing a nomos of righteousness? The Romans. The Romans were pursuing this too. That's what they wanted. Right? The word nomos is beautiful here because, remember, Roman law, Romans were big law guys. Law, right? If I get the right law, then everything will be copacetic in the world, right? And they were looking for a nomos of diakosune, something that would bring them diakosune, this balance. 32, why not? Because they pursued it not by pistis, but as if it were by ergon of nomos. And notice, this really irritates me. The NIV left out ergon of nomos. It's works of law. The King James still has it, but they pulled it out of the NIV, right? Because you see, there is a problem with ergon of nomos, but is there a problem with ergon? Let's see. We'll look. They stumbled. They proskopto. They surged against over the stumbling stone, the proskoma, the lithos, literally the snub stone. And as it is written, 33. See, I lay in Zion a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. That's from Isaiah 8. Let's start with 12. Do not call conspiracy everything that these people call conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. Do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread, and he will be a sanctuary. But for both houses of Israel, he will be a stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble, they will fall and be broken, they will be snared and captured. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. Bind up the testimony and seal up the law among my disciples. Again, take this into context, because Paul is not talking against the law. He's just saying that the law will never allow you to reach what? Diakosune. You can't achieve diakosune through the law. It is only through Christ that you can achieve diakosune. Let's see. We're at chapter 10, and let's go ahead and do the first word in chapter 10. This is not necessarily the beginning of a new argument, but it is this is a change of the argument from, okay, why weren't we made Jews, to now what do we do about this choice? In other words, about proselytizing, about telling others. 1, brothers, literally adophos, siblings not of the same womb. My heart's desire, my oidokia. Good thought and literally diesis, I beg you, okay? Oidokia, I want, you know, I do not like the way they've translated this because I think they missed the point. Oidokia is what? Good thoughts. But oido, when I use that in the sense, okay, it's a good thought, it's not my heart's desire per se. When I use that word in this context, what do you think I'm alluding to? Eucharistos. Oidoke. You know, he's using this, the good news, the good all these things. The good, my good thought, and diesis, my petition, my begging to God for the Israelites, autos, is that they may be saved. And by the way, the word is not Israelites, it's literally for them. So which them is he talking about? What's that?
The Romans too.
I think the Romans too, because see, the translator fixed this issue for you. Paul used the word brothers, adipos, siblings not of the same womb, my heart's desire, my good thought, and diesis, my prayer, my beg, my petition to God for them, is that they may be sotera, saved. Sotera means saved physically, everything. In other words, the pot's saved too. But who's he talking about? Because before, he was talking about not just the Jews, but he's been talking about the Gentiles and the Romans the whole time. So the translator just answered the question for you. He just made it up. He just put Israelites there. The real word is them. Who's the them? In the Greek, it doesn't tell you. Okay? So I think that's egregious when you start doing stuff like that.
Would you then refer back to the previous verse to maybe find the context of who the them is?
If you do that, it can't be the Israelites, because the previous verse was, let's see, and it is written, see, I lay in Zion a cornerstone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that causes them to fall, and one who trusts him. And that was, just before that was, what then shall we say in 30? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith. And then it says, but Israel who pursued a law of righteousness has not attained it. So, yeah, which one is it? You know what I'm saying? Okay, it could be Israel.
It's indeterminate.
Right? It's not very determinate. And Greek is very concrete. If Paul meant the Israelites, what do you think he would have said? I think he would have said Israelites. But I think he left it ambivalent on purpose. Because he wanted to make the point that it wasn't just the Israelites. That's his whole argument before. Anyway, we're out of time, so this will start next week. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray that you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.